So it's a passage we looked at last week, and so we're kind of in this 3-week part to kind of take apart this verse a little bit. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me." So last week we looked at that first part of that sentence. If you want to be my follower, if you want to come after me, if you want to be my disciple, okay. There are 3 things that Jesus lists here. Last week we looked at you must turn from your selfish ways. You must turn from your own ways. And when we look at that last week, I said that to give up your own ways, to say, not my will, but your will be done. It is, in essence, to allow Christ to be center of your life, to rule over your life, so that He will be the one that will steer and guide and drive your life. Today, we want to look at the second part. Take up your cross. Take up your cross. When you look at that second part, take up your cross, I don't know what imagery that kind of gets to you. I don't know what comes to your mind. But sometimes, we take up our cross. That idea for us, sometimes we think it's some kind of burden that we carry in our life. So when I look at this statement, and when I look at and hear and converse with people, they say, "Oh, this is just a cross that I have to bear in my life." So maybe the first thing that I want to say this morning is that the cross is not just a burden. The cross is not just a burden. What I mean by that is this. When Jesus says to take up your cross, the idea of that cross is not burdens or trials that you and I might have in our lives. Some people say, "Hey, this is an illness that I've had for a long time." They might say something like this: "This is the cross that I have to bear. My kids are what they are. It's a cross that I have to bear." It's something like, "Hey, this is just something that I suffer with. This is something that I struggle with. It's a cross that I have to bear." It's almost like we're saying, "You know what? God gave me this. It's a burden in my life, and I just have to accept it." Is that what Jesus is talking about here when He says to take up your cross? Is He simply just saying, "You know what? Just the burdens in your life, I want you to carry that. Just the burdens, the trials, the suffering." I think there's a little bit more to that statement, take up your cross. The cross is not just a burden. There's much more to that. Some people think about a strained relationship, maybe parent-child. They say, "You know what? It's just a burden I have to carry. It's the cross that I have to carry. Someday, I hope." Jesus is not talking about some common trials and hardship that we all experience in our life. I'm sure there is some suffering and there's some hardships with taking up the cross. But I think Jesus is talking about something greater here. I think there's a deeper meaning. And I think when you take up the cross, when we take up the cross, when I look at the statement of taking up the cross, I think there's a couple things that I want to highlight with our, given our time this morning. One is that the cross tests our dedication to Christ. The cross tests our dedication. And second aspect is that there is a cost with the cross. The cross tests our commitment or dedication. Another way to put that is the cross requires our total dedication. Chances are that you and I have never witnessed the crucifixion. It's not common in our time. But in the time that when Jesus is speaking these words, it was a very common thing. Even time before and after Jesus, crucifixion was used by the Romans as a statement, as a message. Don't mess with us. That's in essence what was going on. They wanted to figure out a way. How do we make sure that we send a strong message to those who might try to cross us, those who might try to oppose us. So they devised crucifixion. When I study about the method of the crucifixion, from the very first time until the practice ceased, the Romans began to, after each crucifixion, they tried to figure out ways. How can we make this process more painful? How can we prolong it more and more? And so archaeologists have discovered many different things. As they were digging up, one of the things they discovered was that at some point along the way, on the cross, they found a little piece of wood, like a ledge, on one of the crosses. They were like, why in the world would they have this here? And they concluded that as they were trying to figure out how do we make this process more torturous, at some point the Romans decided to put a little bench on the cross, so that as they're hanging on the cross, they might have the temptation to sit down and rest, which is what prolongs your death. They were trying to figure out how do we do it. And there are stories where hundreds of people were crucified at one time to send a message. So crucifixion, for you and I, we have never witnessed it. We've seen or we've read about it in the Bible. We've seen it in the movies like The Passion of the Christ. So we're familiar with this concept, but we're not really familiar with the sights, the smell, the experience, the emotion, the pain that we see, the agony, and the whole atmosphere. We're not familiar with that. For those in the first century, the imagery of carrying the cross, it would not be a comforting one. Carry a cross. Well, wait a minute. When I see people carry their cross, they're carrying their cross to the place of execution. Why in the world would I want to carry that cross? So the imagery is very different for us today and for them in that time. The Romans used it as a means of execution, a painful and humiliating death. The cross was an instrument of death. So when Jesus says, take up your cross, what is he saying? And that's what we have to try to connect this morning. Literally carrying the cross means carrying their own execution device. Some of the movies and some of the pictures that you might see, you see the people carrying literally the entire cross, right? The crossbeam, everything. But most likely what they were carrying was the crossbeam, the beam that would go across. Carry that, then that would be where they would be nailed and then attached to the rest of the cross and then raised up. So literally carrying that device and facing ridicule on the way. If a known criminal is tried, convicted, and sentenced to die by execution through the crucifixion, they will be carrying that, and from wherever the holding cell or whatever it was to the location of the crucifixion, he would have to walk. And along the way, maybe people will be like, oh, I remember this one. They might throw insults. They faced the ridicule along the way as well as on the cross itself. Oftentimes they were naked. It's just the shame of the whole thing. It was a humiliating death, a painful death. So imagine sitting there, listening to Jesus say this: if you want to be my follower, take up your cross. Not a very comforting imagery. Jesus is telling his listeners to carry the cross, the very instrument of death. If you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple. It definitely has a different meaning than it does today. To carry the cross means that we literally die for the sake of Christ. That is what Jesus is saying. When he says, take up your cross, he means die for me. Having that ability or the willingness to die for me, for my sake. To carry the cross means that we know and understand fully what is at stake. When you're carrying that cross, when these people were carrying the cross, they knew what awaited them when they got there. Take up your cross. Remember I said last week that I've read this verse many, many times and I just kind of run through it. But it was about 2-3 weeks ago when I really started looking at this passage a little bit. And I said, what does it mean to take up the cross? How do we interpret that in our time here in 2016? To take up our cross. Because in this time, to Jesus' audience, this was an incredible challenge. To carry the cross means that there is no easy path, that the path may be littered with suffering, with pain, humiliation, and even possible death. There was a time in Jesus' ministry, at the very beginning, his popularity just started rising. And there's a point in his ministry where he started talking about things like this. He started sharing about some more difficult things. And the people, if you read the Gospels, at one point people are like, man, this is some very tough or heavy teaching. Who can follow this? And what we begin to see is the crowds that just get larger and larger and larger. At that critical point in his ministry, after that moment, the crowds get thinner and thinner and thinner. Because they are like, this is tough. What this guy is teaching, we love the miracles, we love the free food, we love the things, but he's beginning to teach things. He's beginning to challenge us in a way it's a little challenge. It's too difficult. And so many people started walking away. The crowd started disappearing. And then at one point, Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "Are you going to abandon me as well?" So we see the message to take up the cross it's heavy. That there is suffering, potential suffering, pain, humiliation, even death. That is what he's calling us to carry. Connected to the previous statement, turn from your own ways. Turn from your selfish ways. Give up control of your life. Follow me. Take up the cross and be willing to face all of these things. That's what his call is to us. The cross requires our total dedication. Being a follower of Jesus requires our all. Take up your cross. What does that mean? It means that the cross tests our commitment, tests our dedication. It also means that the cross could cost us everything. And that's, I think, one of the things he's talking about. There's an element of discipleship that is often not highlighted very well or very much. Because if we say, hey, follow Jesus and be ready to die, hey, who wants to give your life to Jesus? It doesn't work that way. It's almost like we kind of answer the call and then we start discovering, hey, what does this mean? And that's kind of what our journey is like, isn't it? There's an element that there is a cost to discipleship. It's there, but it's something that's not as highlighted as much as it should be. That there's a cost. When Jesus says to take up your cross, it's a call to give up your whole life, to give your whole life to God. In doing so, however, one could lose everything. Do you know anyone who has lost everything because they follow Jesus? There's a cost. I began to hear a story about a woman in our church. It was in fall of 2012. I began to hear a story about this woman who who became a Christian and now wanted to be baptized, because we were getting ready for our baptism at the church. Her case was very intriguing to me because she was born in Iran. She was a Muslim convert to Christianity. So I was like, I have to meet this person. I want to know. I actually emailed her this past week and I said, hey, can you send me your testimony? I want to share your story. And so she sent it to me and she gave me permission to share her story with you. What God has done in her life over the last about 4 years or so. My name is Rama Rezvani. I was born in Iran and grew up a Muslim up until the age of 33. The education system in Iran is radically Islamic, so that all schools have to follow Islamic rules. The more religious or more religion you show, the more chances you have to be accepted into good schools and universities. I love photography and theater, and so I watched a lot of movies. It was in college where I saw a movie about Jesus for the first time. And that movie about Jesus really struck my heart. After watching that movie, I read all the published books, and I saw all the movies I could about Christianity. She mentions how she tried to gather as much resources as she could, but very limited, obviously, living in Iran. I have my own Farsi Bible. Farsi is the language of the people in Iran. I read my own Farsi Bible once in a while. However, for me, Christianity was one of the ways, not the only way. I was reading and following many other spiritual schools as well as believing all paths will lead to God. So even from a young age, Rama has had this, this desire and drive to know a little bit more. When we talked about her journey, one of the things I remember her telling me was, inside her heart, she just knew that there was something. When she first heard about Jesus, there was something that just tugged her. And she wanted to know more, but she just didn't have an opportunity because there wasn't much. When she reads the Farsi Bible, or reads the Bible in Farsi, she's like inundated with questions, and there's no one to ask these questions. She continues on, and she says, my husband and I moved to Japan because he began a doctoral program in Japan. From Japan, I came to America because I wanted to study environmental engineering. In Iran, she was an environmental engineer. She was working, she was making money, moved to Japan. She came to America to further her studies. However, she was not able to study what she wanted to when she got to America. And to this day, I'm not really sure how she went from Japan to Anaheim, of all places. But she started attending a small college in Anaheim. And the plan was for my husband to come to America after he finished his studies. Life in America was tough. The first few months were extremely difficult. I was afraid and lonely, dealing with the major culture shock of America, as well as depression. I turned to drugs and alcohol to help me sleep and provide comfort. I had a lot of anger and hatred from my past life. I was angry at God, but above all, I hated myself the most. I was so bitter and angry that I attempted suicide 5 times. During the spring of 2012, I began to ask around the school about churches, if anyone knew about a church. And I got connected to Sarang Community Church in Anaheim, which was actually right across the street from her church. Since Muslims are banned to attend Christian worship services in Iran, I wanted to experience church myself. God worked in my heart, and several pastors at the church discipled me and helped answer all my questions. I gave my life to Jesus and was baptized in November of 2012. My decision to follow Jesus was costly. My husband didn't like my newfound faith and divorced me. My family left me, stopped supporting me. My father did not talk to me, as well as other family members. I lost many friends in Iran for the path I chose. This is where Rama and I began to get connected at this point in her life. Because I saw her before the baptism, and afterwards, she came to me. She saw me as well as another pastor off tremendously in that first couple of years when she was just beginning to grow as a believer. All those questions that she had, it's amazing. She remembered them all, and she just fired them away. And I'm like walking. I'm trying during ministry Sunday. We were in a large church, so we got almost 1,000 people walking back and forth, and people are coming to me, and I'm trying to talk to them, and she would come and say, "Do you have some time?" I said yes the first couple of times, and then it just was too long. I said, "Email me." And I said I would get emails, just long emails, and I'm just like, how do I answer these questions? Because some of the questions were just, there was no answer really. Rama's stories is remarkable. I will never experience the things that she experienced. Our backgrounds are completely different. For many, taking up the cross is of great consequence. It is. She knew very well that the decision to follow Christ could potentially cost her everything. Definitely something that she weighed. She struggled with this for a while. For choosing to take up the cross could mean I lose everything. Rama could not ignore God's call, though. She could not ignore his outstretched hand. She had to answer the call. She gave up her own way. She took up the cross. And she followed Christ. It cost her marriage. It cost her family and friends. It meant tremendous hardship, especially since she was a student at the time. She was in U.S. as a student on an F1 visa. All financial support was cut off. So the last 4 years, really, she has really struggled financially. But one of the things that she always tells me is, but God has provided every step of the way. Even now, she's actually studying seminary. She's in a seminary, studying to do ministry so that she can go back into the Middle East as a missionary. And even along this way, God has provided for her. It meant tremendous hardship for her. And yet she writes to me, it was worth it. It was worth it all. One author says this, for most of us, there comes a point in our lives when we are faced with the choice. Jesus or the comforts of this life. And which one we choose speaks volumes about our love for him. There is a cost of discipleship. There is no denying this fact. There are people who want a no-cost or low-cost discipleship. And the funny thing is that Christ, he doesn't offer a low-cost or no-cost discipleship. Discipleship by its very nature has a cost. And often that cost could be everything you hold dear. I feel like sometimes we live in America. It's good in some sense, but it's so unfortunate in other ways. It's unfortunate because we have so much more that we could potentially, the cost for us seems to be a little bit greater. It is a lot to lose. We think, if somebody who doesn't have as much, it's easier. Maybe from a material perspective, from a relational standpoint, though, it's the same. America, we have a greater, it used to be, we have a greater tolerance for Christianity. The foundation of this nation was built on that. It's shaking. The nation is shaking, but the foundation That's what was built, this great nation. There is a cost of discipleship. To take up one's cross is simply to be willing to pay any price for Christ's sake. It is the willingness to endure shame, embarrassment, reproach, rejection, persecution, and even martyrdom for his sake. That statement, take up your cross, is heavy. It is so heavy. This verse is heavy. Take up your cross. To come to Jesus Christ is to come to the end of self and sin. And become so desirous of Christ that you are more than willing to make any sacrifice for him. To take up the cross, to become a follower of Jesus, is to become so desirous of Christ that you are more than willing to make any sacrifice necessary for him. So in the email that Rama sent me, for 3 years, basically she faced rejection from her family. In the email, she wrote to me that last summer, by God's grace, through a phone conversation that she had with her mom, that her mom gave her life to Christ. In Iran. This is ridiculous. Her father has now accepted the fact that his daughter is a Christian. They're talking. What we see is, for her, she's saying, you know what, all of the stuff that happened, I don't change one thing. Because 4 years ago, there was no guarantee that her mom would be a believer, that her dad would open communication lines with her again. But this is what she writes, and I think she says it just perfectly. God showed his faithfulness even in my personal life. God used my life, my joy in Christ, and all his blessings on me to bring my mother to him. She became a Christian over the phone conversation, although she is still in Iran. I hold on to God's promise for my household, for the rest of my family. My father has started talking to me again and has accepted me as a Christian. Although our conversations are very limited and short, I believe it's just the beginning. In this one statement, I sense more hope than I have ever experienced with Rama for the last 4 years. This one statement right there sums up everything. I was there when she has the scars on her wrist, when she was hospitalized, and we had to help her through this process. And she was trying to commit suicide, and she was facing depression, all of that stuff. For me, for someone like that, to see God really growing and now is in seminary and to experience this in her personal life, it's a remarkable story. She says, life is not easy, and I don't ever expect it to be easy. She answered the call, and she says, every day I die to myself. The motive for taking up the cross then is our love for Christ. We love him. See, the person you love, you make any sacrifice. I love my wife, I make any sacrifice for her. I love my kids, I make sacrifices for them. It's what we do. When we love Jesus, then we are willing to make any sacrifice for him. The motive of taking up the cross then is what? Do we want to become a disciple? We want to please him. We want to honor him. We love him. We love Jesus so much that there's nothing that we will not do for him, which includes taking up the cross. For most of us, there comes a point in our lives when we are faced with the choice: Jesus or the comforts of this life. Which one we choose speaks volumes about our love for Him. My heart and my prayer for each one of us is our love for Jesus will compel us to take up the cross.